Now I'm going to pull the chat aside so I can see a little bit. Okay. All right, so today we'll be talking about floodproofing. So I'm going to start with wet floodproofing, and then we'll move on to dry floodproofing and dry floodproofed residential basements and the differences in there. And then we'll compare all of that with wet floodproofing. We'll look at the certificates, and then we'll wrap it up. So, okay. So wet floodproofing is a series of measures that we take to equalize pressure from flood loads that are against an enclosure or a certain type of structure. So we'll go over the different types of structures that are allowed to be wet floodproofed. But basically we have water pressing in, and that's still water and moving water, moving in and pushing in against air on the other side of a wall. And so that type of intense pressure can collapse a wall. And so it could potentially cause damage to the foundation of a building or a structure. So because of that, we have flood openings in them. And so this allows water into the structure or the area and then equalizes that pressure in addition to having it properly anchored, which will also help with the pressure of moving water. We don't want anything to float away. And then flood damage resistance materials below the base flood elevation so that they don't take on any damage from flooding. And then we protect any mechanical or utility equipment by elevating them. And there it says by use of openings, which is what we'll be talking about. And then breakaway walls are for V zones, which we don't have in Kansas. And so the application of wet floodproofing, again, is limited to enclosures that could be below either residential or non-residential structures, and to accessory and agricultural structures. And here it says that have been issued variances, but we'll talk about the different situations about with and without variances and the guidance from FEMA on that. So here's the ordinance language that we have from our model ordinances about enclosures below the lowest floor. And so all of these things are limited in the use that we can have for them, which is parking, storage, and building access. So that goes for the enclosures and the structures that can be wet flood proofed. And so it also has to be certified by a registered professional engineer or architect. So that would be part of the elevation certificate. There are spaces in the A section for this information about flood openings. And so the requirement is to have 2 openings on at least 2 different walls, and then a 1-to-1 ratio in that you have 1 square inch of opening per every square foot of enclosed space. And so that's how we equalize the pressure. And then the bottom of those openings are no higher than 1 foot above grade. And then you can put screens, louvres, or valves, some kind of covering over that opening if you don't like it just being open. So a lot of people don't like it just sitting open, so they can have that as long as it still meets the 1 square inch for every square foot of enclosed space, as well as if there's any mechanism for it to open and close, it must be permanently disabled in the open position, because we can't have any human intervention required for them to work. So here's an example of an enclosure. We'll be looking mostly at crawl spaces today. They're pretty common, but it's no different with any other type of enclosure that you'd have below an elevated building. So here we have the flood openings on 2 different sides, or 2 different walls, that is. And they don't have to be opposite walls. I have heard that a lot. At least just 2 different walls. They don't have to be opposite from each other. And then they're no more than 1 foot above ground. And then you can see the underfloor utilities. So I mentioned utilities and mechanical equipment being elevated. So it must be above the base flood elevation in Kansas. So this sketches from our quick guide, which is Kansas specific. But here's another drawing from the Homeowner's Guide to Retrofitting, which is a good publication. If you don't have it, you should download it, or I could send it to you. So you can see all the flood openings here under the crawl space and also the attached garage. So that's another part of the structure that can be wet flood proofed as well. So the elevation certificate has a section for enclosures and attached garages for making sure we have enough flood openings. And so this is just your typical compliant structure with the minimum requirements. Okay, so like I said, it's common for people to want to cover these up. And so here's a real life example of a building with a crawl space, and the person has come out and covered them up completely. So it's not a typical screen covering or the louvres or valves or those vents that you see that would be available, I would believe, at any hardware store. They've completely boarded it over, so there's no opening at all. So what happened was this was permitted and it was compliant, and then someone noticed later on that the property owner had covered it up. And so they were able to verify that with documentation and get them to uncover it. And then it was kind of a back and forth thing on this. So a good option for them, besides the non-engineered coverings that I talked about, would be an engineered opening. So they are certified and rated to a certain net opening. And so they have certification. It comes with a certificate saying how much it's rated for, and then they automatically open and close with the rise and fall of floodwater. So there's no human intervention needed, and they completely close when there's no floodwater. So that might be a good option for someone like this who just doesn't want to open because they're worried about pests or cold floors in the winter in the enclosures. So that's another option. They're a little bit more expensive, but they can also help someone avoid needing a major retrofit. So if they don't have enough flood openings built into the enclosure, then they could add these to maybe get to that net opening that they need without, again, doing a major retrofit project to get more openings built into the walls. And then there's another example next to that, with wood covering. And then, so that's mostly enclosures. So that would be crawl spaces like what we looked at, a partial enclosure under an elevated house, or even the full story enclosure that you can have, again, limited in use, but it would all be the same requirements for wet flood proofing those. And again, that's on the elevation certificate. And now we'll look at the two types of structures that we can have wet flood proofed. And that's the accessory structure and the agricultural structure. So we'll start with the accessories. And so these, again, have the same kind of use requirements. Of course, these are not attached to your residential or non-residential structure, so there's no building access, but you use it just for storage or parking. So it's not habitable, and there's no other type of use that could be considered commercial. So I have seen people try to call a structure an accessory structure when they wanted to use it for some kind of retail or manufacturing type of purpose. That's not allowed. That's not what it's for. This is supposed to be a low investment, low cost structure, according to FEMA. And so they limit it to 600 square feet. So that's about the size of a 2-car garage. And that's the limit on size. And I've seen a lot of people that want to go larger, but if you wanted to go larger, that would require a variance. So I'll get to variances in a little bit, but yeah, wet flood proofed. So you can see the flood openings here. Again, the same ratio requirement of 1:1 applies. It's anchored to resist flotation, and then the utilities are elevated. So you can see that in the sketch. And yeah, the use requirements. So people will often come to you for a permit or have questions about how to permit a shed. So maybe giving them a printout like this or some other kind of similar sketch with a list of these requirements could be helpful and might help you avoid violations later on. Yeah, so I think that's pretty much it for this particular slide. And then, so here's a good example. This one is not wet flood proofed, it's elevated, and you can see the utilities were elevated. So this one was actually done correctly. We would need an elevation certificate to be able to verify that it was built in compliance. And then here's the type of thing you'd want to look for. There's no flood openings on this. It doesn't appear to be made of the right materials. And if you look closer, it's not elevated or anchored. It's just resting on firewood. So there's a lot of issues here. This would somehow need to be resolved, either elevated or wet flood proofed, or we'd have to verify the materials on that. So we'd have to do something to bring this into compliance. As with this, it has the same issues, not the right material. It's not elevated or wet flood proofed either. It's not anchored. So we have these kind of issues. This could also be a code violation because of the way it's built. So that's what you want to look out for. And so I think Steve was mentioning people that, yeah, this is from Steve's backyard, by the way. So sometimes communities will have people that sell sheds in the community, and then they deliver them and they sell or lease them out. And then they don't tell people about floodplain requirements. They don't talk about wet floodproofing or getting a permit. And so you come across that violation, and then they say that they were never told about the type of requirements that we have in the floodplain for a structure like this. So what you can do is send a letter, certified mail, to these establishments, letting them know that in the floodplain, for this type of structure that you're selling, we need them to be wet flood proofed. And then you explain that and the materials and anchoring and everything in the flood vents. And so people will lease them out, and then they can't put flood venting in them. So it's kind of an issue, but whenever this kind of thing happens, we can have documentation, our copy of that letter that we sent out to these establishments. If people complain that they were never told, we can say, yeah, well, we told them about that, and then they didn't do anything about it. So we've done what we can to let them know that residents in the floodplain are going to have to meet these requirements to be compliant with our regulations. Okay, so the other type of structure that we have that's allowed to be wet flood proofed, and again, it says variances, and I will talk about variances and the policies that have been released in the last year or so. But agricultural structures are limited in use. And so the rules are very similar to accessory structures, but there is a different use. Of course, it's for agricultural purposes in connection with production, harvesting, storage, drying, or the raising of agricultural commodities. And so that can include involvement with livestock, but such as the general feeding barns, but we don't want to see livestock confinement buildings or poultry houses or that kind of thing, livestock operations in the floodplain. We're looking more at the produce side of things. So steel grain bins or the pole frame buildings are really common from my experience, or the corn cribs, that kind of thing. And so if it meets those use requirements, it can be wet flood proofed. There are no size limitations on an agricultural building, unlike the accessory structures. So if there's an open wall, as in this structure, so there's no door on that, the entire one side of the building is completely open, we can count that as the flood openings because it's completely open. If there's a door on it, then we can't count it because a door requires human intervention of some kind. So that's not allowed. But so if it was completely enclosed, then we'd have to put flood openings in it, and of course be anchored. Elevate utilities, have flood-proof materials below the base flood elevation, and all the same requirements as wet floodproofing the accessory structure. Oops, sorry about that. Okay, so here's a good example of an agricultural building. Again, there's no size limitation, so this is clearly larger than 600 square feet, but it's made of flood-proof materials. It has the flood openings in it. It's properly anchored. And so this one looks like it's being used correctly. So I wanted to take a minute to look at the policies that FEMA released last year about granting variances specifically for agricultural and accessory structures to be wet flood proofed. And so this is a different type of variance than you would typically think of. It's not like granting a variance for a house to be built below the base flood elevation. This is more specific guidance on how to do this unless you've adopted the specific standards into your regulations. So we have model ordinance language in our model ordinances on how to do this without the variance. And so this is meant to supersede in technical bulletin 1, 5, and 7. And so we have been waiting for technical bulletin 7 to come out for some time, and it's in draft form. So it's looking like it might come out soon. At least we hope so. And then we can consolidate our future regulations with the new guidance. But it's also important to remember that accessory structures are meant to be on the same parcel as a principal structure. So it has to be an accessory to something, which would be the principal structure. And that use is incidental to the principal structure, such as having a tool shed in your yard with your house. So it's on the same parcel of land, and it's an actual accessory to your principal building. Yeah, I've seen people try to get around that as well. So for agricultural structures, these are some of the things that the policy covers about wet floodproofing and how it can be utilized in lieu of elevating or dry floodproofing. And this is to reduce the financial burden on an agricultural structure that is low damage potential. And so there are more high damage potential agricultural structures, usually ones that have hazardous materials in them. And so the other bulletin that I'll show you goes into more detail about that. If you want to know more, you should definitely take a look at those. But it has to be wet flood proofed. If there's a repetitive loss ag structure, it can be repaired to its pre-damage condition as long as it's still wet flood proofed or dry flood proofed or elevated. And then there's no disaster assistance for that. And if it's not properly wet flood proofed, then it wouldn't be eligible for flood insurance. And that goes for anything that we can wet flood proof, it has to be in compliance. And so it also has to be walled and roofed. So for both accessory and agricultural structures, we're looking for at least 2 rigid walls and a secured roof. So for agricultural structures, we're not talking about holding pens or tanks or pools as far as aquaculture. And again, there's no habitation or employment or entertainment uses. And so I have seen some things like that, or even if people are making agricultural products or drying or storing agricultural products in that building, that they want to also then add a retail or wholesale type of shop element to it. For also where the public meets is another use that you're not allowed to have. And so that would also make it a non-agricultural structure. That would make it a non-residential structure, which would then either have to be elevated or dry flood proofed, and you can't wet flood proof those structures. And then in the policy, it talks more about accessory structures. Again, the walled and roof requirement. So that would be like a 2-car detached garage, carports that meet that requirement, and then storage and tool sheds, which are, I think, more common in what we think of for accessory structures, or a small boathouse if that was an incidental use to the principal structure. And again, no habitation, no public use, employment, or entertainment. And then examples of what is not an accessory structure: gazebos, pavilions, picnic shelters, carports that are open on all sides with just the roof covering. And so a little bit more how to request a variance for wet floodproofing. The policy also talks about how to do it without a variance, but it goes into meeting the definition, the use requirements, walls and roofs, the minimal investment for accessory structures, which is 600 square feet, the low damage potential as opposed to the high damage potential ag structures. And then we're able to prove exceptional hardship if we're not given a variance. And that's always how the variances work. And so that means extraordinary circumstances on local conditions, which means hardship or inequity. And we have to have sufficient justification for that to get a variance. And so we can also have a community-wide exception. As Steve reminded me, I didn't say for agricultural structures, they need to be single wall construction to meet that definition as well. And so, again, criteria for this hydrologic and hydraulic data, which could include our flooding conditions, the duration, frequency, depth, warning time, safety, and access. And so it details how to request an exception for the community, and the FEMA regional office will inform the community if it's granted, and the same thing goes for accessory structures. So here's the longer bulletin, P-2140. It again came out last year. So this is longer, it has more definitions in it, it has more examples, specific construction standards, and it talks about the wet floodproofing methods that can be used and how it can be combined with dry floodproofing measures. It talks about development other than structures, the administrative variance responsibilities, ag structures that could pose a danger to health, safety, and welfare. Those are the high damage potential ones. And then it also includes model language for ordinance amendments and how you can do this without the variance. And so we, again, have that in our own model ordinances. So if you have any questions about ordinances, please get with me. But I would definitely recommend checking out these couple of bulletins, and then keep an eye out for technical bulletin 7 that should hopefully be coming out soon. Okay, so with that said, I think we've got a pretty good handle on wet floodproofing. And so in contrast to that, I want to talk about dry floodproofing. And so we don't actually encounter this a whole lot in Kansas, but I think it's worth being a bit familiar with if you haven't really worked with it before, just to know what to expect, because it is very complicated and there's a lot that goes into one of these designs, and then I'll show you the certificate for it. So active versus passive types of floodproofing measures. So active requires human intervention, passive do not. So basement was the only definition that was in the older version of Technical Bulletin 3, and now Technical Bulletin 3 has a lot more definitions. So I'll be showing you an overview of this update, and it really expanded on how dry floodproofing is done, how these designs are made, and they've broken it down into a process. So flood shields are a critical part of the design. They're often also a source of leakage. The flood protection level, we have to consider insurance considerations, but also complying with the documents that we now have to comply with that are actually outside of the NFIP minimum standards. So it's called ACE 24, and that's the American Society of Civil Engineers. And they have this publication and another publication for calculating flood loads. So all of these things have to be complied with, and it's written into the certificate, which I'll show you. So yeah, and then mixed use buildings have special considerations, and they have a section on this. So those are buildings that have both residential and non-residential uses, such as a hotel. So you can dry floodproof the non-residential sections, and then the residential ones have to be elevated. So here's the overview. I have the table of contents from the older one and then the newer one underneath. And this was released earlier this year. And so you can see how much longer, how much expanse they've put into this document. It was 10 pages before, now it's a little bit over 50. So they've broken the design process down to a 10-step process, but you can see that it's all the way in section 6. So there's all these other considerations to go through and planning before we even start the design. And so It really is a more holistic document that gives a good explanation of how all of these things are related to each other. And then there's more technical references. Like I mentioned, H24 and H7 have to be complied with. And then there's a couple of reports that they mention that have tested certain floodproofing products for accuracy for what they're rated for. And then there's also FEMA P936 that talks about floodproofing designs. So yeah, it's written into the floodproofing certificate that you'll comply with those. And it also fits in with FEMA's promotion of building codes, because H24 and H7 work with the International Building Codes, or IBC, and they are more stringent than the NFIP in most areas. There's only 2 really small exceptions. And so dry floodproofing is where we are taking measures that make a building and its utilities watertight and substantially impermeable to floodwater. So you can see that this is a little bit different, or actually completely opposite of wet floodproofing, where we want water to come in. We invite it in so we can equalize the pressure. Now we're doing everything we can to keep it out completely, which is nearly impossible. So that's why we have some backup measures that are required now. And so we need a floodplain permit, like everything in the floodplain needs, and then a floodproofing certificate. So if we have an existing building, then we have to assess the site, or for a new building, we have to assess the site. We have to look at the flooding characteristics and what kind of structural integrity we need for this to work, because we have to know how it's going to perform under expected flood conditions, as well as being able to withstand the floodproofing itself. So that could mean reinforcement and adding on mounting equipment for panels and flood shields to go on. So it can be stressful on the building already. So that's why we have to understand this architectural and structural systems of the building envelope, including utility systems, whether they can be elevated or if they can be designed to be submerged and then work after minimal cleaning and repair. So in that, if we're using active measures, we have to consider the flood warning time for someone to get out there and install everything. Functional use requirements: if this structure is shut down for some time, are they going to be okay as a business? Safety and access for the active measures. And then once we consider all of this, maybe floodproofing is not going to work for us and we should rather elevate. And most people choose to elevate because, again, this is very complicated and it's a very big undertaking to try to dry floodproof a system. So we have to comply with our local and state floodplain management requirements, reduce damage below the protection level, provide safe and responsible deployment of active measures, because we have to send somebody out when we get a flood warning, and then be able to implement them, and then have plans for maintenance and operations. And after all that, we have a level of residual risk that's still going to be there, because this could fail at any point. We could have a larger flood. The waters could be higher than we expect. We could have a longer inundation time. And so there's a lot of places where this could fail. And because there were so many failures, at least on the East Coast, where there's hurricane systems and that kind of thing, that FEMA really upped the game on requiring these plans and expanding Technical Bulletin 3 to make it more comprehensive, and raising the standards on what we need for this kind of system. So again, active measures, we have to have someone deploy them. Passive measures work without any human intervention, such as some floodgates that rise and close with flood water that rises, or reinforced glass for the windows. So that's why we have flood warning time that's going to heavily impact the design, whether we can do this safely, and then the residual risk again, the downtime, the cleanup, the repairs, and how much risk can be offset by insurance. So it's a delicate balance there. And again, there's a lot of things that can go wrong. So failure could be due to unidentified points of entry, poorly maintained, floodproofing products or measures, or a miscalculation on the flood loads, or again, a larger flood. So there's just a lot that could go wrong. Someone didn't deploy the measures that they were supposed to, or it wasn't done correctly. So here's some measures that we use to dry flood proof a building. We can reinforce the buildings. There's watertight doors and windows, gaskets, sealants, paints, and membranes. You have to have a sump pump of some kind. Backflow valves are definitely a good idea for the wastewater system, flood shields, and then you have to have backup power sources as well. So these requirements, again, they've really beefed up the language to hopefully offset any floodproofing failures. And again, these would all be site specific to our site conditions that we have. And so the two required plans that you have are operations and inspection, and then maintenance. So communities should require the submission of these plans, and then you should keep them with the permit and any of the other documentation that you have for that particular project. Keep it all together, and hopefully you should have someone that can review a plan like this, because it's very technical, and I'll show it to you in a second. But they're also required for the insurance credit. So FEMA has to review everything and then determine if they are eligible for that credit. So here's the emergency and operations plan. And I don't have to read through everything for you to see how in-depth it is and what else required to be able to deploy these measures. So we get the flood warning, then we have to notify that person, and there's a chain of command for responsibility. So everyone is supposed to already be trained and know what they're supposed to do. And then there's a decision tree for installation, and they have to have all the equipment, tools, maybe heavy machinery, the instructions, manufacturing, contact information, and then safely evacuate after all of that's done. So it's very intense. Oh, and this is actually written into the ACE 24 Chapter 6. It's not part of the Code of Federal Regulations, and they just refer to it in the technical bulletin. So if you want to see more about the specifics of that, it would be in ACE 24. And then the other plan is inspection and maintenance. So these are the minimum requirements, but basically we're maintaining all of these things in the off time when we're not dealing with a flood to make sure that we're ready to go when a flood happens, because we can't automatically replace something when we find out it's broken and we're trying to set up for a flood to happen. And then there should be some kind of schedule for revamping this plan, for going through it and updating any and making any needed changes, basically. So again, failure happened a lot, and that's why FEMA changed everything, required these plans, and really made it a very detailed engineering project. And so some of the things, these are reasons for failure that they listed as sort of lessons learned that are in the technical bulletin 3. So what contributed to failure: a lack of plans that were detailed enough, poor maintenance, new occupants move in and no one tells them that there's a floodproofing system or how it works, missing damaged or graded gaskets that are supposed to seal things off, so they just don't work when we're ready to install them, or they come in and do maintenance and the person doing maintenance doesn't realize that they're modifying some kind of floodproofing components, such as mounting equipment for a window or a door, and then your flood shields or your panels are not going to fit anymore. There's nowhere for them to, be attached. So that happens, and that's why we have these required plans now that are definitely critical to the system working. And if they're deficient, it's likely that the system will be deficient as well. So it's very intense, complicated, definitely requires a lot of technical knowledge to review something like this. And so here is the non-residential floodproofing certificates. So you want to pay attention, as you would on all FEMA documents, to the expiration date. So this one is for November 30th, 2022, the same date as the elevation certificate. And also FEMA doesn't update forms right away. So it might be a while in between before we get a new certificate after that. And then I wanted to point out towards the bottom, so it goes over this in the technical bulletin, but you have to have floodproofing to 1 foot above the base flood elevation to get that credit, at least because 1 foot is subtracted from the floodproofed elevation. And so it says that here, but in ACE 24 and those documents that you have to comply with, it talks more about how you determine your flood design class, and it's actually probably going to be more than that, more than 1 foot, but that's written here. And then the next page we have, I just wanted to point out this warning here that it tells you about floodproofing residential basement. That's a separate certificate, and so this should not be used for that. And that it also has to comply with that community's ordinance. And so again, they have to be part of the residential floodproofing program exception. So this should not be confused with that. So hopefully people are reading this and they would catch themselves if they were going to make a mistake. But then we just have the building information and then the mapping information. So again, very much like an elevation certificate. And then section 2 has our elevation information. So this is for finished construction. There's no conditional floodproofing certificate. And then it tells you, okay, floodproofing elevation here, and then your datum, the height of floodproofing on the building above the lowest adjacent grade, and then the highest adjacent grade for unnumbered A zones. And then after that, you would certify this elevation information as the licensed professional. And then for section 3 is where you certify the actual floodproofing design. And you're basically saying, yes, I complied with ACE 24, either the version from 2005 or 2014, or their equivalent. So that's where it's written into the certificate. And then it says, you know, everything with the utilities, the whole thing, watertight, substantially impermeable to the passage of water, and definitely resistant to the flood loads, hydrostatic and hydrodynamic flood forces, including the effects of buoyancy and anticipated debris impact forces. So debris impact is really unpredictable. We don't know what's going to come floating down during a flood. So anything could hit the building, a car, a tree. So they have guidance in A7 for making that calculation, but of course it's really just a very educated guess. We can't predict what's going to hit the building during a flood. So that's another point of potential failure, but then they sign and seal this floodproofing design section. And then the last part, they just have some instructions back here. I thought it was interesting that they include submission of the shields or gates, barriers, and the floodproofing protection products that you're going to be using for the design. It's very much like an elevation certificate with the foundation photos attached to it and everything. So there it is. And then it talks about the maintenance plan here. So that's basically it for this certificate. And so I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about residential basements for about the last 10 minutes or so. And so this is a special program with FEMA. So you, again, have to apply to this program and be approved to be able to adopt these regulations and then permit compliant residential basements. And so it has to be in a place with low velocity and shallow flooding that is 5 feet of depth or less, 5 feet per second or less, and then 12 hours of flood warning time or more. And then it has to be floodproof to at least 1 foot above the base flood elevation, the top floor of any basement, no lower than 5 feet below that base flood elevation. And then it has to be surrounded by compacted engineered fill with vegetative cover to reduce erosion. And then the design is certified, that it's watertight, again, utilities, watertight, impermeable to the passage of water, and can withstand flood loads. So it is similar to the non-residential floodproofing basic requirements, but you can see how this is a bit different. We have different specific regulations on how the basement is done. It's not necessarily about the floodproofing system in the same way. It does have to comply with ACE 24 still, and that is also written into this certificate that I'll show you. And then finally, it is inspected and approved by a community official or a representative for the community to verify that design. And so usually that means floodproofing the basement, extra rebar to reinforce around the top of the walls to withstand all of that pressure. So it's that, and then there's some other specific construction type of techniques that are used to reinforce these, and that will prevent the cracking or bowing that we see oftentimes with just regular non-flood-proofed basements in the floodplain. So here's what it pulls up when you search for this certificate. It has this little warning that the community must obtain an exception from FEMA prior to permitting these types of residences with floodproof basements. So here's the certificate. So this one doesn't expire until June of 2024. So there's quite a bit of time on that before this expires. And so this first page, the beginning part, is much like many of the other FEMA documents that you have. And then it just starts off with the building information, owner's name, address, legal description, all of that. And then section 2 is for the elevation information. So the building is flood-proof to this elevation. The top of the basement floor is here, highest adjacent grade, lowest adjacent grade, and your datums and everything. And then you sign and seal that as a licensed professional. Surveyors cannot do floodproofing in Kansas. It's got to be an engineer or an architect. So then they sign and seal that. And then the next part is, again, we're going to certify that the actual floodproofing design itself is going to be compliant with ACE 24. So there it says in the first paragraph, the ACE 24 from 2005 or 2014 or their equivalent. So it's very similar. It's watertight, again, going to withstand the flood loads, and it complies with the community regulations, and then you have that fill, the engineered fill around it. So I have heard it's a complicated program, and it's a lot like just having a sunken basement because of the construction requirements. It's not like a true basement, and so it's kind of a lot of extra paperwork and work, and probably more expensive to build a structure like this than it would be to do a more simple elevated residential structure. And then at the very end, there's just a short list of instructions. Again, it says that you have to be approved for it, and then for the credit under flood insurance, you have to be in the regular NFIP program and in the special flood hazard area. So I'll go into that a little bit more after this. Yep. And at least 2 photographs of the building. So that's another requirement that is similar. So again, we only have 10 cities in Kansas that have this program, that are in the program, and most of them don't use it. Like people just stopped building the basements, or I don't know if they were discouraged from doing that. But FEMA wanted to take them out of the program. And then we raised some questions about if they were substantially damaged, they wouldn't be able to rebuild in compliance. And so they're still in the program, but many of them don't use it. Again, there's additional issues, And we did have someone, an architect, that just built a house in the floodplain with a basement in a town that was not part of the program. And they ended up downloading the non-residential floodproofing certificate that we looked at for the dry floodproofing. And so because of that, they weren't following the actual guidelines that are different for a residential basement, because the non-residential buildings, they didn't really care about that. They care more about the floodproofing system itself, because it doesn't have to adhere to the same rules as a residential structure. And so they built it that way. It was far too low. It was more of a traditional basement, and the floodplain administrator didn't know that either, that there was a difference or that they weren't in the program. And so they approved it, and it was permitted, and it was 6 feet below ground and close to 8 feet below the base flood elevation. And so yeah, that was a problem. And so that might, some things like that might be why FEMA has put in a couple of warnings on the webpage and a couple places on both the non-residential and the residential floodproofing certificate, so that hopefully people will see that and catch it before they build something out of compliance. And so I was also told about one of these structures that was under construction in one of these. It was an approved community, and they were building the basement, and then it flooded while it was under construction, and they tried to use a waterproof tarp, but it didn't really work. So it ended up flooding, and then it was saved by the water rushing under the footing, and then it filled it in with water, and it again equalized that pressure like we do in wet floodproofing. But so there are different issues that can go along with this program, and I doubt anyone would sign up for it, but just in case, it's good to be aware of it. This is the other compliant floodproofing. And so it's clear that they would be subject to failure, just like the other types of dry floodproofing that we looked at. So it's not the same with active measures and emergency operations, but having a basement in the floodplain, I mean, there's always a flooding risk. So for the insurance, so for the residential exception basement program, again, you're in a participating community, you're in the special flood hazard area. And then the non-residential buildings, again, there's no floodproofing in V zones, but we don't have to worry about that here. So if they're in a participating NFIP community, and again, FEMA reviews the eligibility for those individual buildings based on their entire design, whether they are eligible for that. And so we don't really know what the residential basement premiums are going to look like under risk rating 2.0 just yet. We are kind of just waiting on people that have those types of structures to renew under the new re-rating program. So this is the risk rating 2.0 phase 1 that rolled out on October 1st of this year. So FEMA will have to determine their eligibility. So they pay the full premium, and then they submit that documentation, and then FEMA works with the agent to get them that discount. So again, there's not a lot of these structures in Kansas, and in those a couple of approved communities. And so some of the changes that have happened over the years could impact the rates that they've been getting. So if a community has withdrawn from this program, then they will continue to receive a discount after that, because their risk hasn't changed. So if your risk has changed, you may no longer be eligible for this. So if the entire community risk has changed, then they can't receive the discount as of that rescission date. And then they just go on a glide path to their full risk rate at the time of renewal. And again, we're not quite sure what that's going to look like just yet. But the glide path keeps it below a certain level, so that they can gradually start increasing those payments to get to their full risk rate. And then if some of the areas don't qualify because of a change in risk, those that are still eligible will get their discount, and those that are not, again, are going to go on that glide path to the full risk rate. So we will have to wait and see how that goes. Other than that, I just wanted to take a second to talk about unaccredited floodproofing measures. So when people do small improvements to their structures, they're investing in it. So we should encourage them as much as we can to add in some additional measures that are not creditable under their insurance policies, but can help keep floodwater away from their structures, such as earthen berms, concrete flood walls, or a backflow valve. Things like that can help keep water away from it and help us reduce any flood damages. And then here's the quick wrap up on wet versus dry comparison. So again, we have opposite goals between the two. One, we want water to come in, equalize pressure. The other one is a watertight design where we don't want any water to enter at all. The wet floodproofing has areas on the elevation certificate that are specific to it. Dry floodproofing has the separate certificate. Of course, there's a difference in complexity here. Wet floodproofing is pretty straightforward, whereas the dry, we went through it, it's very complicated, and it's going to be an individualistic, unique design based on that particular site and the structure and the detailed plans that it needs. Dry floodproofing can fail anywhere along the design or the execution of active measures or any of the things that we talked about. And then wet floodproofing, I don't think there's any way for it to fail. Maybe if the elevated utilities were submerged under a very large flood or something, but otherwise it should be okay unless it was just built out of compliance to begin with. And then there's no specific basement standards for the non-residential dry floodproofing. And then we went over residential basement specifics. And then, so the applicability, any non-residential building can be dry floodproofed if they want to. Wet floodproofing is only for enclosures, accessory or agricultural buildings. And then technical bulletins are 3 for dry floodproofing. Again, that was released just this year. And then we're waiting on new 7. But we're anticipating that, but the one that we have currently is from the 90s, I believe. So that takes us just past 50 minutes, and I saved some minutes for questions. If you have any, I'll put my email in the chat. So I will stop sharing my screen and I will stop the recording as well.